Hi everyone, welcome back. My apologies for getting the lecture up a little late this week. It's been a crazy week slash weekend slash everything, so I got a little bit behind on a couple of things. But I won't penalize any of you for my not getting this up by the time I was supposed to have it. So you were asked to read some key texts in what we call Marxist criticism for this week. Karl Marx's Philosophic and Economic Manuscript of 1844 and the excerpts from the German Ideology, Walter Benjamin's Theses on the Philosophy of History from 1940, and Louis Althusser's Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses from 1970. So first off, let's just kind of deal with the elephant in the room here. I know there's a certain elements in society that tends to freak out when they see the word Marxist, right? I am not trying to turn you all into communists, okay? This is not about indoctrination. I am merely trying to explain to you a means that literary and cultural critics often use to analyze texts. Does this particular means of analyzing texts tend to have a particular left-wing bent? Yeah, it does. But we have also discussed several modes of criticism that are ideologically neutral or even potentially conservative, and this is a mode of criticism that you need to be aware of, right, for when you're doing your own research. Right. So this isn't gonna. Oh, there we go. So let's talk a little bit first about who Karl Marx is and what his basic ideas are. Right? So Marx is a German-born philosopher and economist. Spends most of his life in England in exile, working with a partner by the name of Friedrich Engels. So here are Marx's basic principles. First, that the history of humanity is determined by changing modes of material production. So when Marx talks about the means of production or modes of production, he's talking about the overall economic organization for a particular society in producing and distributing goods, right? That's what the means of production is. I should note here as well, right? So Marxism is, I would say, primarily a mimetic mode of criticism. Primarily about the relationship between art and society, in particular art and economics. So for Marx, changes in the modes of production alter the class structure in a given society, right? So say, for example, when we move from feudalism to industrial capitalism, right? Land no longer became as valuable, right? What became valuable was the ownership of machines and factories, right? So the old aristocracy, whose wealth was primarily came from land ownership, found themselves less powerful than the new class of factory owners, right? They were no longer the dominant class. So new dominant subordinate classes are established each time the modes of production in a society change. Now, by dominant class, we mean the owners of the means of production, right? The people who own whatever is used to produce and distribute goods. So you probably hear the word ideology thrown around a lot, right? And here's what it means, at least in 19th century Marxism. Right? Human consciousness is shaped by what Marx calls ideology. Right? Ideology means the beliefs and values of the dominant class. Now, because the dominant class controls the means of production, including most of the means of getting information out, this means that the subordinate classes tend to adopt the same views, right? The ideology of the dominant classes is taken to be reality by basically everyone. And this creates what Marx calls false consciousness, right? So people who don't belong to the dominant class still identify with the values of the dominant class because they're surrounded by them all the time. They're bombarded with these values all the time. They come to assume that these values are what's normal. So, to give you an example, in Marx's own time, and really in our own, the West European and North American bourgeoisie, that is kind of like the moneyed professional class, right? They've been the dominant class in Western Europe and North America since the 18th century. The term that Marx used to describe the subordinate class is proletariat. Right? Proletariat would be, in our case, wage earning workers, right? People who work for an hourly wage. But Marx argues that bourgeois ideology shapes our current perception of reality through dominating our cultural institutions and practices, right? So because culture is basically set up by the bourgeoisie for the bourgeoisie, everybody ends up adopting the set of values common to the bourgeoisie. So things like say, for example, free market economics. Now, a key concept for understanding Marxist cultural criticism is the idea of base and superstructure. So the base, for Marx, refers to the dominant economic model in a particular place and time. So say if you're writing in the 1840s, as Marx was, industrial capitalism, right, would be the base in most of Western Europe. And the base determines the shape that is taken by the superstructure. Right? The superstructure is built on top of the base and refers to cultural formations like religion, politics, literature, arts, anything of that nature, right? So here's a handy little illustration. You can kind of think of it as a pyramid, right? The base at the bottom is the economic system. And the superstructure is everything that gets built on top of that, right? So the base supports the superstructure, but also determines its possible shape, right? Certain kinds of cultural expression are not going to be possible or desirable with a base that's the wrong shape. I'll give you an example. So the Catholic Church is the dominant religion in Western Europe for most of the Middle Ages, right? Now, one could argue that the structure of the Catholic Church, right, mimics the structure of feudal land ownership, right? So the way feudal economies work, right, with a king at the top of the pyramid who distributed land to his followers, who then distributed land to their followers, which was worked by bonded serfs, right? Now, if you look at the way the Catholic Church distributes authority, right, you've got a pope at the top who gives authority to cardinals who are responsible for large regions, who then devolve some of their authority to bishops who are responsible for, say, individual cities, who devolve some of their responsibility to parish priests, whose duty it is to care for lay people in individual neighborhoods, right? So we can see how that structure mimics the economic structure of feudalism, which was based on trying to get land to produce enough food to support a support a knight and a small military life. So one of the key Marxist thinkers, kind of post-Marx, writing in the early 20th century, is this guy Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci is an Italian philosopher, journalist, and political theorist who spends much of his adult life in prison. He's imprisoned by the fascist regime in Italy in 1926. Is released in 1935, but dies 2 years later because he's been so weak and sickened by his experience. This is his mugshot, actually. So Gramsci's key work is called The Prison Notebooks. It wasn't published in his lifetime. It's a series of notebooks that he kept while he was in prison, outlining his ideas and also probably trying to keep himself sane. And there are a couple of things that Gramsci reveals in his notebooks. One is that he is more interested in folk and popular culture than he is in elite art. So this is going to provide sort of the basis for what we call cultural studies later on. He also introduces a concept that Marxist thinkers call hegemony. So hegemony is the result of a social class achieving dominance by making its ideological views completely pervasive throughout society. So ideology is the views and values themselves, right? Hegemony is the dominance that the dominant class achieves by making their views everyone's views. Gramsci also revises Marx's notion of base and superstructure as well. So for Marx, the base is completely determinative of the superstructure, right? You can't build certain kinds of superstructures on certain kinds of bases. But Gramsci actually argues that they have a reciprocal relationship. That in fact, the shape of the superstructure, or like the activities of the superstructure, can change the base. That it's through art and cultural practices and politics that the base is potentially altered. Now, I also wanted you to read some Walter Benjamin. Benjamin is associated with a group of thinkers in Germany in the 1930s called the Frankfurt School. So this is a German school of Marxist-influenced philosophers and cultural theorists. Key individuals in this group are Benjamin, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and a few others who are a bit less well known. But by and large, they're called the Frankfurt School because they're initially associated with an institute founded in 1923 at Goethe University in Frankfurt called the Institute for Social Research. And what they were trying to do, their common project, was to formulate an integrated approach to the social sciences and the humanities, right? So a lot of Marxist criticism today is this kind of attempt to fuse social science research, particularly in sociology, more so than in psychology, with humanistic study. In 1933, they moved from Frankfurt to Geneva due to political pressure from the fascists, from the Nazis, I guess we'll say. And then to New York. Most of them were based at Columbia University in 1935. Walter Benjamin remained in Paris for long periods of time until the Nazis invaded France, and then he died trying to escape into Spain. They're heavily influenced by Marx and by Gramsci. So one key term that comes out of the work of the Frankfurt School is the culture industry. So they use this term to refer to the capitalist mass production of cultural objects, right? So while Gramsci is very much interested in folk culture and popular culture, what the Frankfurt, one of the things the Frankfurt School worries about is the commodification of popular culture, right? Taking popular culture and turning it into something that the dominant class can sell to the subordinate class. In fact, Horkheimer and Adorno argued that the culture industry is one of the primary means of breeding false consciousness in the proletariat, the subordinate class. Whereas Walter Benjamin actually had a more positive view of the culture industry. He argued that mass production could give ordinary people greater access to art. This is actually something that Andy Warhol will also argue in the 50s and 60s. Right? He's trying to create art that is both accessible to ordinary people and by mass producing it also becomes affordable for ordinary people. So this is Walter Benjamin. He's a philosopher and art critic associated with the Frankfurt School. And you were asked to read his theses on the philosophy of history. So I'm curious to know on the discussion boards what you all thought of this. It's not, a lot of Benjamin's work is not so much written in the form of a coherent, consistent, sustained argument, but tends instead towards these kind of like disconnected paragraphs of aphorisms. And the theses on the philosophy of history is very much like this. However, we can detect certain very important themes running through this, right? Certain consistent patterns. So one idea that runs through this is the idea that history is not, as was often argued in the 19th century in Western Europe, a straight diagonal line moving upwards always towards progress, but instead requires human effort to keep moving forward. Right? People, like, if we want progress, people have to work for it, basically. There's also a particular attitude towards time here, right? That time is simply an illusion that gives coherence to our experience. This sounds a little bit. Some of this sounds a little bit similar to phenomenology. It is. Phenomenology was a big thing in German universities around the time Benjamin was a student. The past for Benjamin becomes history when it is made relevant to the present. But uncritical celebration of the past tends to benefit the existing power structure. So say like, nostalgia and celebrations of tradition tend to be things that benefit the dominant class, right? That codify the status quo. And revolution, for Benjamin, is an attempt to disrupt history and reinvent time, right? To create something genuinely new. I see a little typo in here. He also introduces the term historical materialism. And what this means, right, it's an attempt to disrupt the flow of chronology by linking past, present, and future together, right? So instead of, simply looking backward on some imagined glorious past and celebrating that in the present, right? You are fusing knowledge of the past, glorious or not, with present concerns and an attempt to build better future conditions. All right, so moving on, this is Louis Althusser. So Althusser is a French, or was rather, a French political philosopher and cultural theorist. And you may have noticed that a lot of French intellectuals who were active in the 50s through the 70s fused something with structuralist ideas, right? So, you know, the way Jacques Lacan, for example, you know, not to be confused with Jacques Lacan, uses psychoanalysis with structuralism. The way Jacques Derrida uses Nietzsche's philosophy with structuralism. Yeah, structuralism is very much kind of like in the water that these folks are drinking in French universities in the post-war period, right? So Althusser is fusing Marxism with structuralism. And what he comes up with is a kind of redefinition of ideology. It kind of like follows a structuralist method. So Althusser says that ideology is really an imaginary relationship with reality. Right? It's the way we see ourselves mirrored in our society. This also sounds a little bit like Lacan in the symbolic work. That what we think are choices that we make are actually the result of social practices that we're embedded in. And our relationship to reality is shaped by the social practices in which we are subjects. Now, subject has a kind of double meaning in Althusser, right? So you might remember that in structuralism and in psychoanalysis, subject is a kind of active term, almost like the subject of a sentence, right? So the subject, for example, in structuralism, is the person who produces a text, right? What used to be called an author. While in psychoanalysis, right, the subject is the person producing, say, the dream material to be analyzed. Althusser means those things. The subject is the person acting in a social context, but the subject is also subject to various authorities, right? So when he talks about being a subject, he is talking almost like being the subject of a particular ruler or government, right? So social practices for Althusser teach individuals their own characteristics and the range of properties that society will allow them to have, right? So much, you know, again, there's a lot of Lacan in here, right? This idea that we learn how to be in society by observing how other people treat us and each other, right? You know, we are almost like, right, a sign in a sign system. Right? If society is the sign system, we are individual people are signs. So, your concept of your identity for Althusser is based on the social practices in which you are embedded. Right? This is how you learn how to be who you are. So he also refers to something he calls ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs. An ISA is a social authority that exists to teach you your specific role in some aspect of your life through a process called interpolation or hailing. So interpolation is the moment when an ISA dictates to you your proper function as a subject of that authority. Right? So say, for example, we're thinking of school, right? ISAs include things like the family, the church, the state, the media, the educational system, right? Basically anything that has any kind of authority over you, any system that has any kind of authority over you, right? So the moment a teacher calls on you and identifies you as a student, right, and you respond, you are a student, right? You are then in that social role. So this is the moment of interpolation, right? There's one more Marxist thinker I want to talk a little bit about, largely for sentimental reasons. He's a personal favorite. And I didn't actually ask you to read any of this stuff because I don't think there is any in the book I had you buy. But he's also the progenitor of a line of inquiry that comes to be called cultural studies. So Raymond Williams is a Welsh literary critic who is primarily concerned with analyzing the relationship between intellectual and social history. I'm trying to link those things up. So one thing that Williams notes, particularly in his book Keywords, is that changes in language and meanings of words occur when the economic base shifts. It's not just, so language then is part of the superstructure, right? When the base changes, language changes as well. Now, when Williams writes about what would come to be called cultural studies, right? A lot of this is based on particular definitions of cultures, right? So, of what culture is. So he provides a couple of competing definitions for culture, right? First, in pre-capitalist societies, right, culture means a network of social relations based on ideas, right? So in pre-capitalist societies, Williams argues, people's social connections are formed primarily based on ideas. In post-capitalist societies, right, so after that capitalist revolution in the base takes place, culture becomes a realm of values and objects that are independent of society and history, right? That suddenly kind of like our time and our immediate geographical context go out the window, and culture is kind of like based on things that can be owned and can be possessed, right? In fact, that will be possessed and defended by cultural elites. Williams' own preferred definition of culture is the relationship between all the elements that contribute to a way of life. And this is what his primary concern is like with people's relationships to arts, to literature, to cultural practices, and the way these things become embedded in people's everyday lives. Not just as a reflection of elite power, right? But also how culture is often a means that the subordinate class uses to push back against the values of the dominant class. All right. So how do you do a Marxist reading of the text? I'm going to give you an example. Charles Dickens's novel, novella, A Christmas Carol. I believe most of us are probably familiar with the plot, right? You have a miserly old moneylender, Ebenezer Scrooge, who is visited by 3 ghosts on Christmas Eve, all of whom represent different temporal coordinates, and who show him scenes first from his own life, then from the lives of his neighbors and associates, and then from his future life, or lack thereof, as the case may be, in order to try to get him to open up his fucking wallet and just be a decent person already, right? So the message of this novella seems, on the face of it, to be kind of a lefty one, right? That people should be generous and share what they have. But if we're actually looking at this from a Marxist perspective, we see that it's actually a very kind of pro-capitalist kind of message. So if we think about the economic context in which the novella is written, right? So the base at this time would be early industrial capitalism. But it's also written in a time of economic depression in Western Europe and North America, right? Referred to as the Hungry 40s. And government policy, in England at least at the time, in Britain, was austerity, right? So we were going to wait out this depression by cutting back spending and making money tighter across the system. And so a lot of what Dickens is trying to do, it seems, in the text is encourage other middle-class people to spend money to get the economy moving again. So there are references, for example, particularly early in the novella, to Scrooge's insularity. Right? He's referred to as solitary as an oyster. Right? He has no friends. He has no real sense of personal identity. Right? He answers to Scrooge or Marley, but doesn't care how people address him. He's doesn't even care about identifying himself as an individual. He identifies himself entirely with his business. And we see also that Scrooge, who hoards his money, right? He lives in a cold room, eating gruel, right? Spending money on nothing inessential. Everyone in the novella we see who is actually happy is happy kind of through the spending of money, right? I mean, yeah, there's family togetherness and stuff like that, but it's always kind of centered around something viable and consumable, right? We have, particularly in the Christmas present episode, this long, detailed description of the things available for sale in the market, right? That is designed to get, like it seems like calculated, to get people to go out and buy Christmas presents. So yeah, the solution to Scrooge's problem and to society's problem more broadly seems to be wider circulation of money. Right? Keep money flowing, keep money moving, keep trade going. Right? So this is essential. This is how you do a very basic Marxist reading of the text. You think about, okay, like what's the economic system that is the underlying base here, right? What's the economic system that shapes this expression of superstructure? And how then does the superstructure express these base values, right? This ideology that pervades the culture and society of the time? All right, so I hope this was helpful. I hope you don't think I'm trying to turn you all into little communists. And I will see you on the discussion boards to talk through this further. So please, any questions you have about any of this, post to the boards. I'm happy to answer. All right, we'll see you then.